All right, hi everybody. Today we're going to start our lecture for Chapter 9. Today we start a series of 3 hypothesis tests that are all called t-tests. So we're going to be running 3 different t-statistics. I know it seems maybe weird, but that t is definitely lowercase. We'll have a symbol for a capital T later in the semester. So just like technically the z and z statistic was lowercase, the t and t statistic is lowercase, just for clarity later. Don't want to mix this up with other symbols. And in Chapter 9, the type of t-test we're doing, as you can see, is called a single sample t-test. It's going to be important that you can tell the difference between t-tests. You're going to be given hypothesis tests on the next exam that'll say, the very first question will say, what t-test are you supposed to be doing? This one or one of the ones from the other chapters? They're pretty easy to tell apart. Ultimately, this word single tells us something important twice, and single sample tells us half the answer. So single sample t-statistic says that we are going to gather one sample and we are going to measure that sample one time. That's what we've been doing already in Chapter 8. We gathered one sample and measured them one time. But for t-test, that's called a single sample t-statistic or t-test. So one sample measured one time. That's what we're doing here. So what we're going to try to accomplish is the same thing we've already been doing. We're not doing anything new or different with this. We're just getting a slightly different setup. The major difference, and you'll hear me say this probably several times across this chapter, the major difference between a t statistic and a z statistic is pretty basic. Let's think about, to compute a z statistic, one of the things we had to have was a measure of standard error. And our formula for standard error in the last chapter looked like this. I'm going to write the variance version of the formula down because we're really only going to be dealing with variance more or less for the rest of the course. So variance over sample size divided, square rooted. So we need to know the size of the sample, and we need to know something about the variability of the population they came from, either standard deviation or variance. Well, here's the thing. In the real world, we almost never know what the variability of the population was, either standard deviation or variance. We almost never know that. If we don't know that, we don't have a value to put into this equation. And if we don't have a value to put into this equation, then we can't calculate error. And if we can't calculate error, we can't calculate a z statistic. So z statistics are where we start. They're very basic, but you won't find them in published research hardly ever because they're so simple and they require information that, again, we just don't tend to have in the real world. So remember that one of the things that I've been saying over and over and over again is that the role of the sample is to represent a population. Well, we may not know what the variance in the sample, in the population was, but we will be able to measure the variability in our sample. So the fundamental difference between a t-statistic and the z-statistic is that for t-statistics, we're going to use sample variability as a substitute for the population variability. So more specifically in this case, we're going to put sample variance in this formula because that's what we're going to have. So one more time, the fundamental difference between a t-statistic and the z that we already know how is that t-statistics, all 3 of them, t-statistics use sample variance in place of population variance. Other than that, they are exactly the same things in principle. They use the same 4 steps to do the same 4 things. We'll see a couple of the little changes that come with this substitution. That substituting this value out will cause a couple of the things to change as well. But fundamentally, it's almost exactly the same. You're going to find this to be, compared to Chapter 8, a pretty short chapter because it's almost all stuff we've already known how to do. So that gets us our introduction for this information. So in the next part, we're going to start walking through the 4 steps generically, just like we did in the last chapter. Then we'll plug in an example. and then we will move on to some other considerations that we have to learn about for this. And that's it. So we'll start walking through the steps and see what's the same and what's a little bit different in the next video. See you there.